This is just a video to introduce the lightning generator. What I have is 5 ignition coils wired up in series, switched in parallel by this camera flash here. Got that wire over there that goes in series with the capacitor. I just plug it in here, turn the flash on, and I'm using this optic sensor here to fire it so that I don't have to be connected to any of this wiring, because I don't want 250,000 volts backfiring through my fingers. What I've done is, for sunlight, I've put this tube on it, because in the past I found that it doesn't fire in sunlight unless you put a tube over it and make it dark inside there, because the sun just sort of keeps it switched all the time and it doesn't see the flash trigger. So I'm using that to trigger it, and a Nikon camera flash, doesn't matter which one you use of course. I'll put this on 1/8 on 128th power, so it doesn't interfere too much with the exposure. That's still fired up at the moment. There's our spark gap of about 7 or 8 centimeters. When I fire it, we get our spark. Just move that away from there, put it down here so it doesn't show so much. So there's our spark, and the Nikon D40 has a CCD sensor, which is actually a global shutter. When it fires, we don't have a slit sliding down at high speeds with the shutter. The whole sensor switches on and off at every speed. So I can take these photos of a spark at up to 1/4000th of a second with this camera. An old 6 megapixel camera, no one wants them anymore. You can pick up a body for $50 or so. Problem is, when you put the flash on, it limits the shutter speed to 1/500th of a second, which is the synchronization speed of the flash for this camera. So what you have to do, you have to make it so the camera doesn't know there's a flash connected. There's communication pins at the back there, which tell these communication pins that there's a flash attached. So what you do, you take a little piece of paper and you slide it under the back pins. When you slide it on, the camera doesn't know there's a flash attached. So at any speed you take a picture, it'll fire the flash. The middle pin is for firing the flash. If you take a wire and you touch that middle pin to the earth contact here, it'll fire the flash every time. And that's what the middle pin does every time you take a photograph. It fires the flash, and the good thing is that it does it even at 1/4000th of a second, even though it shouldn't use flash at that speed. But it does, so we can photograph that spark at 1/4000th of a second. Now, even though I say this is 300,000 volts, it's based on the statement that I read that it's 1 centimeter for 30,000 volts. And I measured my gap at 10 centimeters the other day, and I was still getting a spark. I'm just going to disconnect this, turn off the camera flash, plug these together so that I get to see the end of this video. But the whole principle of a spark gap is that it's capable of 300,000 volts, but if we move the gap 1 centimeter, it's going to be 30,000 volts, because that's all it needs to jump that gap. But it's going to be 30,000 volts with about 10 times the current, because it's going to flow for longer. I'll just illustrate on a car system. On a normal car ignition system, the car's spark plug has normally a 1.1 millimeter gap, and under compression it takes about 8 or 10,000 volts to jump that gap. So you have a coil. Modern coils are capable of about 50,000 volts, but if you put an oscilloscope on it, you see about, let's say we'll call it 10 kilovolts to make it easier. I've seen about 8 on the older spark systems. That's the spike it takes to jump the gap, and then it burns down maybe around 1000, 2000 volts for a while, and then you see an oscillation there. That's the energy that can't jump the gap. And with my old ignition coil, I was using this ignition coil, the primary and the secondary windings joined together back here. So that energy that couldn't jump the gap that I had created before would come back to my finger through the camera flash. These coils don't seem to do that. I think the primary and secondary windings are totally separate from each other. But if you were to open up your gap on your spark plug, and a vehicle comes in with worn spark plugs, then you see a much higher spike, but a shorter burn time. So a lot of energy is used to jump the gap. There's not much energy left to continue burning. With a lean mix, you get a misfire, even though it's firing, because it's not burning long enough to light the mixture. It needs a longer burn time, which is apparently one of the reasons capacitive discharge doesn't work so well on modern engines, because they burn leaner. An old rich burning engine, capacitive discharge system was fine. It could light the rich mixture, but as it got leaner, it needed that longer burn time, which resulted in misfires if it was too short. But what I'm trying to get across is the fact that even though this old ignition coil might be good for 30,000 volts, it doesn't fire at 30,000 volts. It depends on the size of the gap. So if you make a small enough gap, it'll fire at 2000 volts and keep burning at that. But it's when you open it up that it needs higher voltage to jump that gap. So what I was getting over there was a one fast spark with very short burn time, because there wasn't any energy left to continue jumping that gap. Now you may ask what I'm going to do with this. I love to experiment. I love to see how far I can push the boundaries. What I'd like to do is see what I can do outside in the sunlight, because I can take these pictures 1/4000th of a second. I've actually got an old Nikon D70. These can do 1/8000th of a second. I might do a few experiments with that. This I basically got free. I bought it for $100 with two lenses, and I sold one of the lenses for $100. So I've got a camera with a lens left over for free that I can experiment, but then it goes to 1/8000th of a second. And I have tested it, and I do capture the spark at 1/8000th of a second. And that's, at the moment you push that button, the shutter opens, the whole sensor switches, triggers a flash circuit, the flash fires, the light goes to here, to the optical trigger here, that flash fires, the electricity goes through there, generates a spark, and you photograph that spark all in 1/8000th of a second. What I'm playing around with at the moment, I bought a split diopter. It's a close-up lens that only covers half of your camera lens. Yeah. So you screw it on, one half is normal, the other half it's a +1, which means when you focus at infinity on this half, something 1 meter away should be in focus. So I'm hoping to maybe go out at night and set it up so that I've got this little lightning strike in the sky, and then quickly pull that off and carry on with a long exposure so that it looks like I've got lightning in the sky. I don't like using Photoshop to do things. I like to be able to do things straight from the camera. So that's the beginning of it. In the comments you can maybe suggest something I can try with it. Someone did say to me, yeah, put it in a bottle of gasoline or something. I've tried that before. I took this ignition coil and I fired 25,000 volts down there in a bag full of petrol. Nothing happens. The mixture's too rich to burn. I took this, I put one electrode down in the petrol, one up in the air, and I fired it, and you could see 30,000 volts jumping in this bag full of petrol. It needs to be the right mixture. I don't know how people get explosions by accident, and it's so hard to create them on purpose. Some people are just lucky, I suppose. But anyway, that's the introduction to the lightning device. Watch this space. Hopefully I'm going to get to do some more tests with it and take photos that nobody's ever seen before. And I've also included a few sample images in the video that you can see what I've done so far. Just going to show you how the lightning device is wired up. We have 5 ignition coils. Those are the primary windings. Those are the secondary windings. Is the camera flash. Now, the primary windings are joined up in parallel. And the secondary windings are in series. So the voltage coming out of there, which is about 50,000 volts out of each one, adds to each other, and we get 250 to 300,000 volt spark over there. The primary windings go through the camera flash. There's a capacitor that goes up to the flash tube, and what you do is you cut that wire there, and you run 2 wires out here which you can join together and it'll fire normally, or you can use it to fire through the primary windings. So when the flash fires, all that energy going through the flash tube goes through these 5 primary windings. Because they're wired up in parallel, it's divided by 5, the current. The current isn't as important to me as the voltage. So if we got about 250 volts over here, we might get about 100 volts or so drop across there. I still need to measure it. But it's better to have 100 volts to each one than 20 volts to each one, so that we get a higher voltage output. The flash itself, when I fire it, there's a PC plug, and I take it to an optic sensor, because I don't want to be touching that there. I've been zapped by my 300,000 volt Marx generator before, because I had it connected up to another ignition coil and to my flash. I'm using a camera flash to trigger it and an optic sensor, so I don't have to touch that circuit.